As we started, firstly, thank you for joining us for this interview and accepting to give us your insights. And would you like to prefer to start with briefly telling us about yourself and your work, and we can continue with the questions afterwards?
I'm the ambassador of Sri Lanka in China. Been here for about 20 months now. Prior to that, I was the Sri Lankan permanent representative to the United Nations in New York with the rank of ambassador. Before that, I was the foreign secretary of Sri Lanka. I can go on and on. I think that will suffice for the moment, huh?
All right. Then I'll be directly passing to the questions. So, for first question, how would you describe the diplomatic and economic relations between China and Sri Lanka?
At the moment, the relationships are very good, very warm, very close. The two countries are enjoying a very fruitful and very productive relationship at the moment. As you know, Sri Lanka has had a very long and close relationship with China, extending over 2,000 years. In more recent times, Sri Lanka was one of the countries that engaged with China economically since the 50s. In 1952, we entered into what was known as the Rubber Rice Agreement, under which we agreed to sell rubber to China and in exchange for rice. That agreement was active till about the early 1980s. Sri Lanka also was one of the most vocal champions of China resuming its seat at the United Nations. In more recent times, China unequivocally supported Sri Lanka in its struggle against the separatist terrorist LTTE, and again, extended diplomatic support to Sri Lanka at international fora. China was the country that supplied us with COVID-19 vaccine in 2021, at the time when the epidemic was threatening to spin out of control in Sri Lanka, and also when other countries were either incapable or were reluctant to provide vaccine to Sri Lanka. In fact, it could be said quite honestly that today Sri Lanka has the epidemic very much under control, largely due to the 26 million doses of vaccine supplied by China, 3 million of which was provided as a gift. Today, Sri Lanka has opened its borders. Visitors can come in. If they are vaccinated, they can enter the country without any restriction. And as a result, tourism, which was a major player in our economy, is beginning to revive. So I think on the whole, the relationship between the two countries is very good. China also extended an emergency aid package earlier this year when Sri Lanka was confronted with an unprecedented financial crisis, largely catalyzed by the COVID-19 pandemic.
All right, thank you. And for our second questions, what were the main advantages and disadvantages that you have perceived in the Sri Lankan's PRI projects?
As you know, the PRI was launched in 2014 by President Xi Jinping. It was envisaged that something between 4 trillion and 8 trillion US dollars will be invested in the wider region. Sri Lanka welcomed the BRI at the highest levels, and we continue to embrace it. As a result of BRI funding, we have the Colombo Port City now reclaimed from the sea, Hambantota Port and adjoining industrial zone, highways which have made a massive difference to transportation within the country. Just to give you an example, prior to the construction of the Colombo Gold Highway, that journey used to take 5 hours, very short distance in global terms, but it used to take about 5 hours. But now the same journey could be undertaken in 70 minutes. It's made a huge difference. Similarly, there is the Central Highway and others being constructed, water projects, electricity projects, etc. So the BRI funding has made a significant impact on the economic, social, and cultural life of the people. As we all know, the BRI funding in the region also is beginning to make a big difference in Africa in particular, and in our own region. So I would say that the BRI has made a big difference and will continue to make a big difference within Sri Lanka.
Thank you. And what do you think are the main differences between the BRI funding and the EMF funding?
The most significant difference is that BRI comes with no conditions. There's no conditionality attached to the BRI, while an IMF always has conditions attached. Sometimes these conditions have very little to do with the funding. They seep across the spectrum of human activity. And this is one of the reasons why Sri Lanka had been reluctant in the past to actually activate its IMF relationship. However, this time we had no choice. We had gone to the IMF, and we probably may be given a dose of medicine that will be difficult for us to digest. But this was an exceptional situation. On the other hand, BRI funding has increasingly become more sensitive to the cultural needs of the people, the social needs of the people, and also the environmental needs of humanity as a whole. Now, BRI funding is not necessarily directed towards development alone, but also towards conservation. So I believe that in the long run, the BRI will be very beneficial to us. That is not to say that we could ignore the IMF. There are times like now, Sri Lanka has been compelled to seek IMF assistance, and hope that the IMF assistance will not result in too much difficulty for the common persons in Sri Lanka.
Thank you. And in the recent years, many Western countries use Sri Lanka's recent economic problems to undermine the usefulness of BRR. And how would you, Your Excellency, would prefer to respond to these claims?
I have read these comments coming from the West, and I have responded to these comments also. Sri Lanka benefited from the BRI funding, and there's no doubt about that. Sri Lanka did not go looking for BRI funding. Or on the other hand, let me phrase myself differently. Sri Lanka went for BRI funding because there were certain urgent requirements for the development of the country. These were not decided on willy-nilly. We had a 27-year-long terrorist problem in the country. When the terrorist problem ended, there was an urgent need for quick reconstruction and development. We approached many of our traditional funders, and we did not receive any joy from them. Then we approached the BRI, China and the BRI. And as I said earlier, today we have very impressive highways to show for it, harbors, airports, etc. China did not come to Sri Lanka with BRI funding. In fact, it took considerable negotiation to persuade China at the time to extend financial assistance for our development needs. So some of the commentary that is coming out of the West, I think is misplaced and really not consistent with what really happened at the time.
Thank you. And what does Sri Lankan government think about the current situation with the Hambantota Port project? Does Sri Lankan government perceive it as a successful development? And if so, why?
See, Hambantota was intended to be a port to serve the main shipping route linking the Middle East and East Asia. And it's only 20 kilometers away from that shipping route. Of course, like any major project of this nature, you can't expect windfall returns overnight. It takes time. The users have to get used to the idea of the port being there, and then it will become more popular among them. And over the years, last 3-4 years, the number of ships using the Hambantota port has increased. Now there is a bunkering facility available, and it is doing good business, a private sector company, and it's doing good business. And I have no doubt that over the years, Hambantota will become a major midway port for ships plying across the Indian Ocean from the Suez Canal and the Middle East towards East Asia. You have to remember that 60% of the energy needs of East Asia is carried past Sri Lanka. So the very fact that this port is there will be an incentive for some of those ships to make use of Hambantota. In the same way, Sri Lanka is today the main break bulk port for the subcontinent. Large ships come to Sri Lanka, to Colombo, and increasingly to Hambantota. They will disgorge the loads into smaller ships to be carried to the subcontinent. Similarly, smaller ships from the subcontinent will continue to come to Sri Lanka to make use of the bigger vessels that ply between East Asia and the Middle East and through to Europe. Today, Hambantota has become a major port for the distribution of motor cars built elsewhere and being distributed in the subcontinent, and also subcontinental cars being brought to Hambantota to be reshipped on larger ships to distant users. So, although that's only an example, the use by motor car manufacturers of the port of Hambantota, in the future, we can imagine others also will use that port in the same way. And I don't think two commercial companies that lease the port would have entered this venture if they knew that it was not going to produce returns for them. Already the returns are there. In fact, there are commentators in Sri Lanka who would say that even if we had not leased the harbor at the time, we could have benefited from the increased usage that is being made of the port. So on the whole, I personally think Hambantota will be a very lucrative commercial proposition in the years to come. It's a pity that Sri Lanka will not be making use of that.
Thank you. And with the fall of the economic growth rates of China post-COVID crisis, do you think that the future BR projects are likely to happen in Sri Lanka? Or do you think that it's not more likely in the future?
It's true that the growth rate of China has slowed down, and I don't think China was actually relying on its growth rate to fund BRI projects. Perhaps some projects might be delayed or shelved because of the slowing of the growth rate. But at the time when the BRI was launched, it was going to rely on China's massive stock of reserves, which it still has. And the amount that will be invested may be different from the originally envisaged $4 to $8 trillion, but it certainly is going to be a significant amount, significant enough to make a big difference for the developing countries of the wider region. And these countries were yearning for funding for their development. And that yearning was never satisfied by the traditional funders. And when China comes along and with its massive reserve of resources, financial resources, and offers the BRI to the developing world, not only in the Afro-Asian region, but even beyond, countries jumped to it because earlier their needs were there. Their needs were very apparent, especially in Africa or in South Asia. But these needs were not met, or massive conditionality was attached to those who were lending to satisfy some of these needs. But now we have a funding source which will meet most of the needs of these countries, whether it's roads, bridges, harbors, mining complexes, etc. So I think the slowing down of the Chinese growth rate will be a factor we'll have to keep in mind for the future. But then China was never going to rely on its continuing growth rate for funding the BRI. And as already many countries in Central Asia and Eastern Europe have linked up with China and have used BRI funding for their infrastructure development programs. We now have the China-Europe Railway, which is plying between the two destinations, both ways, carrying manufactured goods plus consumables, both ways. And there are literally hundreds of journeys being taken every month. And there are various hubs from which the trains leave China. So things are happening despite the slowdown of the Chinese economy.
Thank you. And as you know, there has been a lot of claims in the West naming BRI as a debt trap, using Sri Lanka as an example. And how would you like to respond to these claims?
I've said this before. I think it's unfair and mischievous to use Sri Lanka as an example of a debt trap. Less than 10% of Sri Lanka's external debt is owed to China. They owe a similar proportion to other countries like Japan. And the vast majority of our debt is owed to multilateral institutions, the World Bank, ADB, etc., and institutional investors. So 90% of our debt is owed not to China, but to other entities. So if there ever were a debt trap, and I don't think there was a debt trap, it's owed to Wall Street, not to China. China owns only about 10% of our external debt. And when China extended its funding to Sri Lanka, it was usually at a concessional rate. The interest rates were much lower than the commercial rates. And then, of course, the maturity periods were also much more favorable. So to suggest that the lending from China suddenly became a debt trap, I think is a misplaced allegation, and I think it even verges on being mischievous.
Thank you. That was quite interesting, to be honest.
The fact, I'm not relying on propaganda for what I'm saying. I'm relying on facts. Yeah. While the term debt trap itself is convenient propaganda.
Yeah, we to be totally honest, we don't hear this view at all in the West. I can't recall any newspaper that I've read these. That's why we're actually having this interview to begin with, to be honest. Thank you. For the next questions, what's the current public opinion on Sri Lanka in Sri Lanka regarding the agreement to give 70% of the shares of Hambantota Port projects for 99 years to China, a Chinese merchant port holding company limited, for 1.12 billion.
As I said, there are many people in Sri Lanka who think that, justifiably, that there was no need to have leased the port to China Merchant, and also now the newly constituted Hambantota International Port Group, HIPG, of which Sri Lanka still holds a significant percentage of shares. But it's a done deal now. It's a contract that we signed. So we need to make the best of it. Let's see what will happen in the future. But let me say that Sri Lanka has always honored its contractual obligations. And I don't hear any discussion in the country which suggests anything otherwise.
Thank you. And maybe, as you have also heard, that in the Western economic world, there has been some debates about will China use Hambantota ports in military usage, and how would you like to comment on that? This.
I think it's,
a lot of people are actually super curious.
I don't want to use too disparaging a comment to describe that allegation, but China has never said that it wants to use Hambantota as a military facility. And Sri Lanka went through 27 years of brutal conflict to prevent a separatist group from breaking away. And we are not going to be in a hurry to give away a part of our territory to anybody to be used as a military facility. Sri Lanka will not do that. Will not even encounter that possibility. So let me say that China has never asked to use Hambantota as a military facility, and I find that an incredibly difficult suggestion to absorb, because China doesn't have the military muscle in the Indian Ocean to counter India or the United States. India is a power to be reckoned with in the Indian Ocean. Just by using Hambantota, it's not going to make a big difference to the current equation. And then just 400 kilometers to the south of Sri Lanka is Diogo Garcia. It's either the biggest or one of the biggest US military bases in the world. But I think it's ridiculous to suggest that China is going to make a big difference to itself by using Hambantota. In fact, I can't even imagine what it would want to use Hambantota for. So I pay no attention to this allegation. I think it should be dismissed just with no attention at all.
All right, thank you. And do you think that there was any relation with the BR projects and the corruption cases surrounding it?
Yeah, people have been saying that, but it's easy to demonize someone or ruin their reputation through allegations. Until there is evidence to justify the allegation, we should treat an allegation just as what it is. You cannot convict anybody with allegations. You need verifiable facts, evidence. So I think we should just leave it at that. These are allegations and nothing more.
Okay. And what do you think that's the riots in Sri Lanka, how will it affect the relation with China?
Again, I wouldn't describe them as riots as such. We have seen riots elsewhere in the world, everywhere, whether it's Paris or LA, there have been riots. But in Sri Lanka, there were, for a long time, peaceful demonstrations, and we encouraged them. We did not attempt to stifle those demonstrations. These were demonstrations staged by people who were hurting due to the shortage of fuel, electricity, food, medicine, etc. Then, for some reason, at some point, the demonstrations were taken over by certain groups who caused necessary riots. The presidential secretariat was taken over, the president's house was taken over. And today, all that has been contained. The country is rapidly returning to normalcy. And in the process, not one single foreigner was harmed. Not one single foreign investment was attacked. And that includes Chinese. No Chinese person was harmed. No Chinese investment or established was attacked. So the demonstrations themselves have not caused any difficulty for the relations between two countries. And the new authorities have established very close links with China very quickly. And I think although there was some uncertainty at some stage, now the country is returning to normalcy, and our traditional relationships are being nurtured in the same way. We value those relationships, especially our relationship with China, and it will progress without any hindrance. That's my view.
Thank you. And as you know, US and Europe, the European countries recently have been trying to counter China's growing influence in the world by creating new funds, such as Build Back Better. And do you think that there's any chance for Sri Lanka to get closer with Western powers regarding these new funds?
I think it's very disappointing that these countries, US and the European countries, waited till China came up with the BRI to come up with a concept like Build Back Better. It should have been there before. Many of those European countries enriched themselves with the colonies. The colonies suffered as they enriched themselves at the expense of the colonies. These programs should have been launched much earlier without waiting for China to come up with the BRI. So if they're at least now entering the development race or the race to assist developing countries to get ahead in the world, I think it's a good thing. But I personally don't think just trying to compete with China is going to be of much value to anybody. It's not through competition with China, or that should not be the motivation for helping developing countries get ahead. Developing countries should be assisted because they should be assisted, not because China is already there helping them. It's disappointing, very frankly, that these countries have waited till China started helping countries to enter the process of helping poor countries. They should have done this much earlier, and they owed it to the developing world to do this, but didn't. Instead, waited till China came in, and now it is commentators are saying that this is to counter China. Why on earth should China be countered? China is helping developing countries to do better, to get ahead, to improve the lives of their peoples, to improve their economies. Why is there a need to counter that? It's a very good thing that they're doing. If the developed West wants to do something, they should do it because they want to help the poor countries, not because they wish to counter China. I think the purpose behind, say, if that is the purpose, Build Back Better, is to counter China. I think that is very misguided. I would hope that Build Back Better is an effort to help poor countries to improve their lives, improve the lives of their people, improve their economies, and make those countries, help those countries stand up on their own feet. It should not be an effort on the part of the developed West to counter China. I hope not, because there's no need to counter China. China is doing something good. while China is doing what it can, these other countries also should do more. They should have been doing more earlier, long before this, without waiting for China to start doing it. So I think my short answer to your question is that Sri Lanka is not going to get involved in this game. For Sri Lanka, what is important is development for its own sake. Sri Lanka needs a better life for its people. It needs to be able to stand up in the world on its own feet. And if China is doing it, we are grateful for that. And if everybody else wants to do it, and this is something they should have done much earlier. Even now, it's not too late. We would like them to step in and help my country realize its own potential. One thing that has been happening in the past, is a constant barrage of advice on what we should be doing. What we need is more than advice. We need tangible assistance.
Thank you. And as we have quite a short time left, I'll just go to the last question. Are there any plans for Sri Lanka to participate in the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership in any near future?
We have already applied to upgrade our membership, our participation rather than membership. You're not a member, and we hope that sooner than later our request will be granted.
All right, thank you. And we have only 5 minutes left, so I'll try to go with one last question as well. How does Your Excellency think that the current regional power struggle in the Indian Ocean will affect Sri Lanka?
The power struggle, I think, exists in the minds of certain individuals and certain commentators. I do not see, and I'm here in Beijing, I talk to a lot of people, I read a lot of material. I do not see China wanting to participate in a power struggle. And then we hope that that will not be the case. In Asia, we were left behind by the Western world as it surged ahead. And for a long time, we were exploited as colonized countries. We never had a chance to do well on our own right. Now, we should be, there's no need to create a situation like during the Cold War, when we are made the pawns of somebody else's game. Asian, African, and Latin American countries would wish to develop because it is what they deserve. Their people deserve that. They deserve a future where they're not somebody else's pawns. So I think to characterize what is happening in Asia as a power struggle, I think is only feeding to this commentary, which has received a certain degree of appeal in the West. I think we need to get away from this commentary. Asia and Asian countries should be encouraged to help to develop and stand up on their own right, on their own feet, rather than be just appendages in somebody else's ambitions for global power.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for all your insights and explaining us your country's perspective in this quite interesting questions. As our time seems to be nearly up, so I'll just finish it with saying thank you for giving us your time and your insights and everything.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. I enjoyed it.
Thank you. Have a lovely day.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.